June 14th this year, something happened for the first time in human history. A country held a referendum to ask its people whether their population growth should be capped. In the end, the Swiss said no. But here's why this matters for Cayman. The people of the Cayman Islands are experiencing something very similar to what drove Switzerland to that vote. And just like Switzerland, no one has ever formally asked Caymanians what they actually want until now. Today, I'm going to unpack the relationship between population growth and some critical socio-economic variables in Cayman, like GDP or economic activity, government revenue, jobs, construction, inflation, and the cost of living. And then I'm going to ask you to take a brief, anonymous 10-question survey that takes less than 2 minutes, I promise, so that we can put what Caymanians actually think on the record. Let's get into it. So, first of all, a few weeks ago, I was walking on 7 Mile Beach and having a wonderful time, of course. And I was just horrified, however, at the amount of litter on the public volleyball beach, like right in front of Hotel Indigo. So I took some pictures, I posted about it on LinkedIn, and I, of course, sent it to Miss Sandra from CMR TV. And by the next morning, the entire beach was clean up. Where else in the world would that happen so quickly, if at all, right? And it's only Cayman that this would happen. And that is why I love Cayman so much. Of course, the natural beauty, and of course, the food. This last trip, I fell in love with cassava cake. And I was just wondering how come it took so long for me to discover this. But so glad that I have. And people in Cayman are just next level, right? But it goes much deeper than that for me. Because as I've always said, the Cayman Islands is the best run country in the Caribbean, in my humble opinion. The people of Cayman genuinely care and they want to do better and they want to be better and they are truly, truly world class. And that is exactly why this conversation matters. So, where does Cayman stand on its population and population growth? Well, the United Nations expects that the global population will peak in this century and will actually begin to decline later in this century, about 74 years from now. And 1 in 4 people on this planet already live in a country whose population has peaked and is now declining. In the Caribbean, we have 14 such countries. And those countries whose population is declining are Barbados, Cuba, Jamaica, Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and others. The rest of the Caribbean will peak and start declining within the next 30 years, but except for 6 countries: the Dominican Republic, French Guyana, Haiti, Suriname, and the Cayman Islands. Cayman is one of only 6 countries in the Caribbean expected to keep growing its population beyond 2054. The UN projects the population will reach 107,000 in Cayman in 30 years, peaking at 118,000 around 2098. Right now, the ASO estimates that the population is just about 91,000. And according to the World Population Review, Cayman already has the fastest annual population growth rate in the Caribbean at just under 2% a year. Now, here's something important to understand about why Cayman's population is growing. The 2021 census found that the average number of children per female in the Cayman Islands is just one, which is well below the replacement rate of 2.1. And that means that without net inward migration, Cayman's population, like most of the Caribbean, would actually be declining. And we know that the population growth is being driven entirely by net inward migration and people choosing to come and live in Cayman. And that raises a big question. Why are the authorities so motivated to let that continue to happen, given that people appear to be so uncomfortable with this? So here's where it gets really, really interesting. Population and economic activity in Cayman, or GDP, are highly positively correlated. As a matter of fact, the Auditor General said in a November 2024 report that between 2018 and 2022, there was a high correlation between GDP growth and population growth. And that correlation was even stronger when looking at the non-Caymanian population growth and that its effect on GDP growth. Now, correlation is not causation, and the report didn't say which causes which. Does population growth cause the economy to grow, or does the economy growing cause population to grow? And actually, I think it probably works both ways because Cayman's growth makes it an attractive place for people to come and live and work and raise families. But also, foreign workers coming to Cayman create economic activity. So it goes both ways. But here are the three main channels through which foreign workers, in particular, coming to Cayman, create economic activity in the Cayman Islands. First, there's work permit fees that the government collects, and then the government spends these work permit fees primarily on its personnel costs. That's the largest line item in the government's spending budget, right? Second, the demand that foreign workers create for construction, for things like housing, workplaces, offices, schools, roads, airports, all of that demand for construction drives economic activity because construction has the largest multiplier in the economy. And third, the broader consumption of these foreign workers, things like the goods that they consume, rent and services, all of these things add to government revenue and also add to overall economic activity in Cayman. Now, the Minister of Finance stated in the 2026-2027 budget address that the correlation between government revenue and GDP, or economic activity, in Cayman is almost 100%. So they move almost in perfect sync, in lockstep. When GDP grows, when the economy grows, government revenue goes up. And again, he did not say which direction is the causation. Does GDP growing cause government revenue to go up? Or does government revenue going up, and of course government spending out of that revenue, does that cause GDP to go up? Again, we think it might be both directions, right? But in any event, based on this almost 100% correlation between government revenue and economic activity in Cayman, we can actually conclude that the government of the Cayman Islands is heavily incentivized to support economic activity, to try to grow economic activity, because it will then lead to further government revenue. And how else does GDP, or economic activity, grow in Cayman? Well, the construction sector was found by the ESO to have the highest economic multiplier in Cayman. So much so that the ESO found that for every dollar of construction activity, total economic output increases by $2.56. And also, for every $1 million in construction activity, 16 additional workers are needed across the economy in Cayman. And what drives construction? Well, people do. People need somewhere to live, somewhere to work, somewhere to send their kids to school. Tourists need accommodation and restaurants. We all need roads, we all need airports, and yes, somewhere to send our waste. So the chain looks like this. More people, especially high-wage foreign workers, means more work permit revenue for the government, more construction, more GDP growth, and again, more revenue for the government. And this is important because roughly half of the government's revenue comes from the financial sector alone, which is also the single largest contributor to GDP, or to economic activity, in Cayman. And over half of the government's annual budget is spent on personnel costs. In fact, the government is the single largest employer in Cayman, with about 8,300 public sector employees, 70% of whom are Caymanian. So the government is heavily incentivized to keep growing the non-Caymanian population in order to keep growing its own revenue, in order to pay its own largely Caymanian workforce. So I just want to talk now about something that does not get enough attention, and that's carrying capacity. A 2022 consultants report projected that Cayman would reach absolute physical limit of what can be imported through the cargo port when the population reaches $100,000. And we're now at about 91,000 according to the ESO as of December 2025. Sustainable Cayman has called for an independent carrying capacity study to understand the limits in Cayman for housing, transport, schools, utilities, and ecosystems. That study has not yet been done. And yet, here we are, with steady inorganic population growth, rapidly approaching the cargo port's stated limit. And one would hope that the authorities, at minimum, would respect that 100,000 threshold, because if we go beyond that, we might be taking our food security and other types of food and energy security, putting that at risk. A recent Cayman Compass article also noted that Cayman is already short by more than 3,000 homes and will need 5,000 additional units over the next 15 years just to keep pace. And that would require tripling the current construction activity for a decade. And the necessary infrastructure, roads, sewage, water, is not currently adequate enough to support that kind of growth. Now, Cayman has the second highest cost of living in the Caribbean after Bermuda. And unlike Cayman, Bermuda's population is actually declining. So clearly, population alone is not the only driver of high living costs. There is a 98% correlation between Cayman's population growth rate and its inflation rate. And while we can't prove causation with the data we have available, it is reasonable to assume that a larger population, alongside imported inflation and customs duties, that pushes prices higher versus higher prices somehow attracting people to Cayman, right? But this is critical. Cayman's inflation rate is actually low by regional standards, 1.3% last year, which is below the Caribbean average of around 2% and below the global average of around 4.2%. The biggest price increases in Cayman over the past 8 years was in housing, a 47% increase in the housing and utilities category of the consumer price index was observed in I think it's over an 8-year period. And that's the largest increase of any category. But this is not just a population problem. This the fact that housing prices have gone up so much. To me, it is fundamentally a planning failure. I think that the authorities have been collecting work permit fees from foreign workers for years while failing to ensure that adequate housing was built to accommodate them and to accommodate everybody else, not just the foreign workers. Then there are other factors driving cost of living that have nothing to do with population. And high energy prices is one of those, right? And it's all imported. We also have monetary policy that's tied wholesale to the US and their Federal Reserve decisions. And that could be part of why the cost of living is high in Cayman. We also have a regressive taxation framework. All of this I've talked about and published articles about in the past. And these all can be addressed by government policy, regardless of what the population size is. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about some of the other pressures being felt in Cayman. Let's talk about Mount Trashmore. Each person on the island, according to this recent Cayman Compass report, each person on the island disposes of around 7 pounds of waste per day. And at the current growth trajectory, space will run out within a decade. Now, is that the fault of the foreign worker or the tourist? I don't think so. It is squarely the responsibility of the authorities who have not expanded waste management commensurate with the number of people that they allow into the Cayman Islands. There's also traffic. The congestion in Grand Cayman is truly remarkable. But again, other countries, Singapore, for example, they manage this. And don't come for me in my DMs to tell me we can't compare Singapore to Cayman, please, because on a per capita basis, the government of the Cayman Islands spends roughly the same amount as Singapore per capita. So the issue is not resources. I think the issue is planning, the issue is political will, and the issue is being able to execute on what those plans are. Let's talk about crime. Some attributed this to population growth. In Switzerland, certainly, that was one of the things people talked about in the run up to their referendum. But crime is also rising in Caribbean countries with shrinking populations. Crime is a complex, decades long problem in the Caribbean, rooted in transnational organized crime, of course, involving gangs, narcotics, etc., even human trafficking. And this is regional. But we also have the issue of proper vetting of foreign workers in Cayman. And I think that this crime problem is not strictly a population growth problem because I think it can be managed. Now, has anybody ever really thought about whether population growth is truly responsible for the discomfort that you're feeling in Cayman? And I think this, and this is an honest question that I'm asking. Is population growth via net inward migration truly the source of the discomfort people are feeling in Cayman? Or is poor planning and economic mismanagement the underlying problem? Because throughout history, from Brexit to Venezuelans and Haitians fleeing to other Caribbean nations, to the political sentiment in the USA today, immigration is almost universally blamed for whatever socioeconomic struggles a society is experiencing. And I want to offer a few different perspectives. First of all, rapid change of any kind makes us uncomfortable. And we are living in a time of rapid change globally, not just in Cayman. There are factors driving cost of living that are completely unrelated to population, such as energy prices, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and government policy can address all of these. This is not strictly a population problem. And on the issue of wages, people saying that, foreign workers come in and take our jobs. The thing is, Caymanians occupy mostly the middle to low wage jobs rather than the majority of the high wage positions. And the data and employer feedback suggests that this is because of a shortage of appropriately skilled Caymanians for these high skill roles. Why is that? Because only 27% of students in government primary schools and 37.5% in government secondary schools are achieving the expected education standards. And this is not an immigration issue, this is an education policy failure. And I want to be clear as well about a skills gap analysis that has never been conducted in Cayman. We don't know precisely what skills employers need now versus what they will need in the future, versus what the Caymanian workforce currently has. And until we know that, we don't know how to design an effective education strategy. Ultimately, the responsibility rests with the authorities to manage all of these things, to plan properly, to accommodate the foreign labor and tourists they permit, and to protect the well being of their people in the process. Singapore, again, is the proof of what's possible with vision, with planning, and with accountability for implementation. Back in 1999, Cayman had a Vision 2008 focused on harmony and prosperity through balanced growth, but it didn't survive implementation. And while it never set a specific population target, it could serve, in my view, as a foundation to build on, augmented by a genuine public consensus on where Cayman wants to go. One factor that might explain why that vision didn't translate into action in Cayman and possibly in Switzerland as well, in my view, is inequality. Cayman's Gini coefficient, which measures its inequality, barely moved since 2007. And economic inequality is one of the strongest predictors of democratic erosion. Because when the wealthy elite can finance campaigns, they can increasingly shape policies in their favor at the expense of everyone else. But here's the good news. Inequality and poverty are not accidents, they are policy outcomes, and they can be reversed with different policy choices. And campaign finance reform, I think, is an obvious place to start. So let's summarize what this article that I wrote basically tells us. Higher population, especially high wage foreign workers, means more government revenue via work permits in Cayman and more construction. Construction has the highest economic multiplier in Cayman. More construction means more GDP growth. More GDP growth means more government revenue. Therefore, the government of the Cayman Islands has been and remains highly incentivized to grow the non Caymanian population. And as of May 1st this year, new migration reforms made it more costly and more difficult for foreigners to live and work in Cayman. The effects of these reforms will take some time to play out, but they could dampen work permit demand, slow population growth, slow construction, slow GDP, and reduce government revenue with knock on effects on the quality and levels of public services that the government can provide. Now, the bottom line is this: the size and trajectory of the non Caymanian population is one of the most powerful levers shaping Cayman's socioeconomic future. And right now, Cayman is drifting towards an unknown population size by default. A number reached by default is still a number that you will have to live with. So, how do you feel about all of this? Well, I have created a brief, anonymous 10-question survey. It takes less than 2 minutes to complete, and the results will be analyzed and published so that what Caymanians actually think is visible to the people making these decisions and visible to all of you. The link is in the description below. The best way to predict your future is to create it. And the voice of the people is the voice of God. A direction set by many tends to serve more, and few places, in my view, understand that better than the people of the Cayman Islands. The link is below. Please take the 2 minutes and respond to the survey, and please share this widely. Thank you very much.